All right, everybody, welcome back to the Glass Less Traveled. My name is Mike Verevi. I am a certified bourbon steward and founder of the Fox Valley Whiskey Society. We're going to explore and introduce you to craft distilleries, microbreweries, industry insiders, and professional imbibers to give you the inside scoop on the things you need to be drinking. If you like what you're watching and want to help us expand, please check us out on Patreon at patreon.com/theglasslesstraveled, and don't forget to click that subscribe button. Tonight, we're here with the master blender at MGP in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, David Whitmer. David, thank you for coming on tonight.
Absolutely. Thanks, Michael.
So for those who don't know what MGP is, what is MGP and what exactly do they do?
All right. Well, this will take an hour.
Yeah.
Most people know MGP as a distiller for other people. I mean, in a lot of ways, we say we're the largest distiller you've never heard of.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because for years, we have produced, whether it's vodka, gin, bourbon, rye whiskey for other people. And then a few years ago, we decided that we could have our own brands. And so we launched, the first one we launched was our Till American Wheat Vodka.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next was our George Remus Straight Bourbon Whiskey. And then Rossville Rye Union.
Which I got here.
Very good. Yep. Rossville Union Rye. And then we have a blended whiskey, a blended bourbon whiskey, which is called 8 and Sand. And I can talk about that a little bit later too. And so while we continue to make a lot of particularly rye whiskey for other people, we've had a lot of fun really launching our own brands, and we're in 16 states, so none of them are nationwide, and we're really trying to help people know about high rye bourbon because we're known for that, and rye whiskey.
So before we got on, I had asked you, how you kind of got started in the whiskey industry.
Yeah,
it's hilarious. I think it's fantastic how you kind of got started in it. Talk us through. You have a degree, obviously, in chemistry, so obviously that's where your expertise comes in. But tell us about that story that you told me right before we got on.
Yeah. So people often ask, well, how long have you been in the distilling business? And I say, well, I distilled my first alcohol at 13. And the story goes, I needed a science fair project, and you can only do so many volcanoes and
and more volcanoes. Yeah.
Venn diagrams. So I decided that I would make alcohol, and my grandfather and uncle had a dairy farm, and of course I had a lot of grain. My dad took me to the pharmacy, and we got the other things that we needed. I ground up the corn, mashed everything in the basement, and then set up a distillation column at the kitchen sink. My mom thought I was probably going to blow up the house, but she let me do it. And so I made grain alcohol.
Sure.
Yeah. Sure. So I took it to the science fair and talked all about it. I had some fermentation going where I had it closed and it was bubbling it was hosed into some water so you could see the CO2 bubbles going as my little visual. And then there was two local professors who were the judges, and they kind of looked at each other and they both sniffed the alcohol, and then they both took a sip. And I thought I was going to get in trouble, but no, and I got first place. So,
well, bravo.
Yeah.
And now here you are.
That's right.
At what most people call, and you call, the largest distillery that most people have never heard of.
That's right.
So the Glass Less Traveled is a podcast of sorts that focuses on small craft distilleries and craft breweries. MGP is not either of those things, but without MGP, many of these craft distilleries would not exist. And a conversation that's happening on social media and on message boards is it fair that these distilleries and bottlers are sourcing a product rather than making their own right off the bat, when other craft distilleries are making their own product right off the bat? Now, obviously, there's a very biased opinion in that, and there's answers yes, no. Everybody's got their opinion. For those that are kind of unfamiliar with the process, can you give us some insight as to why a distillery would choose to source a product rather than distill their own right off the bat?
Sure. And it's no different than Michael, you would decide tomorrow to start a brand. And whether you have a distillery or not, you say, I like bourbon or I like rye whiskey and I want to start a brand tomorrow.
Sure.
And we would help you do that. And some people have come to us and done exactly that. Others have said, I started this distillery. I've made some good stuff. And I know I won't have anything to sell for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
So what could I do in the meantime? Well, they could make vodka.
Right.
They could make gin.
Mm-hmm.
They could make White Lightning.
Sure.
Whatever that really is.
Right.
Sugar the heck out of it. And then, or they could come to us and say, I want to use you as a bridge.
Sure.
I want to use this to get my brand established. And however they decide to transition later from MGP liquid to their own, whether that is they end up blending, they just go cold turkey and go straight to their own, that's
Sure.
up to them.
Sure.
And so, but if they come to MGP, for the most part, they're going to get a high rye bourbon.
Mm-hmm.
And I can explain what I mean by that here in a minute, or a rye whiskey. And the more that people get to experience those and understand those and appreciate those, I think is great.
Yeah, and so the question really came about, and the reason I wanted to ask this is I'm on a lot of these Facebook groups on Facebook, and somebody had commented, and I think it was probably somebody that was a little bit newer to bourbon and didn't really know what sourcing was, and said, do you think, why is it fair that, somebody, that brand A goes out and buys their bourbon or their whiskey from somebody else, and brand B is trying to build something? And my answer to that is, well, MGP is there to kind of give you something to drink while somebody else's dreams are aging in a barrel for the next 4 years. This was a dream. This was a passion project for them. This wasn't just something that they woke up one morning and were like, hey, let's start a distillery. We talked with Nick Nagel over at Whiskey Acres out here in DeKalb, Illinois, just a small local distillery out here. And he said, his wife is, if it weren't for his wife working, the distillery doesn't pay the bills. So if it weren't for, folks like MGP or even some of these other distilleries out there that are contract distilling, what I've got, behind me in a barn that's going to be aging for 4 years, I wouldn't ever be able to let you sample the dream that I want you to sample. So, not a lot of people understand the quality that MGP puts in their product and the passion that they display when they're helping another distillery or helping another person kind of get off the ground and say, here's some product that we have, and if you like it, here it is. So I think it's a great thing that you guys are doing. But I want to talk about the high rye because you guys are known for the high rye. Most bourbon nerds know that most of the rye whiskey produced in the U.S. comes from MGP. Rye is a resilient grain that grows well pretty much everywhere in the United States, and historically was at one time the drink of choice along with brandy in the United States before bourbon was born. Tell us about the high rye and particularly the this fantastic Rossville Union that you guys have.
Sure. And so what you just showed, the Rossville Union, is a rye whiskey. Now, to be a rye whiskey, by law, it has to be at least 51% rye. And at MGP, we make rye whiskeys that start off at 51% rye, and we go all the way to 100% rye. And when they're not 100% rye, the other 49% are really left to the distiller.
Sure.
So you could do one with a lot of corn, which makes that rye sweeter. You could do one with a lot of barley malt, which is going to almost give it that malty or nutty even characteristic to it.
Sure.
And I think what most people know about MGP is what's called 95-5. So that's a 95% rye, 5% barley malt. Okay? So when we did our Rossville Union, this one that you so kindly showed, yes.
Great rye, by the way. Great rye.
Thank you. It is not a single mash bill rye. It is actually a combination of some of those various rye mash bills that I just talked about. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because most people buy a single mash bill from us. We don't want our brand to be just like somebody else's.
Mm-hmm.
And by being a combination of mash bills, it adds complexity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the goal or the job of a master blender is that whatever you produce must be greater than the sum of its parts, or 1 + 1 must equal 3 or 4 or 5.
Right.
Yeah. And so if you put something with a rye, high rye, because it's a rye whiskey,
Mm-hmm.
but then has corn in it, that's going to make it sweet.
Sure.
Barley malt, it's going to change it. High rye, spicy. You put all those together, and it doesn't physically layer in the bottle, but it kind of layers on the palate.
Sure.
And so that way, each sip might bring a little more character to it than the last sip. And so
Right.
you get these kind of changes in taste that are kind of surprising, but also very nice.
Yes. Yeah. And one thing that I noticed with this rye is that it doesn't have that peppery bite right off the
Mm-hmm.
bat. It's very well rounded. I like to describe whiskey as I like to use the word full, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how well does it kind of round the palate, and how well does it fill the palate? Can I taste it on the side of the tongue, the back of the tongue, the front of the tongue, the middle? Can I feel it on the roof of my mouth, on my cheeks?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I like to feel in a whiskey. And this particular rye is very full.
Right.
What was it like? I mean, this is one of your projects. What was it like blending this project? I mean, walk us through those, like, pulling out of the barrel and sampling. I mean, what is that whole process kind of like for somebody who isn't familiar with the blending process?
Mm-hmm. Right. So you start very broad in that you've got different batches, and of course with this one, different mash bills. I mean, at most distilleries, the job of a master blender would be to take the exact same mash bill and maybe pull barrels from various parts in the warehouse so that when you put your product out, it's always consistent.
Right.
And so you always are thinking about in the future consistency, but the first time you do it, it's just blank slate. So
Right.
What do you want this to be? And one of the goals and really the priorities with Rossville Union was it needs to be an approachable rye.
Mm-hmm.
Because rye's a great category, but it's still a small category compared to bourbon.
Yes.
And some people may have had a bad experience with rye. It burned, it hurt. But we also heard, I want to like rye. Some of my friends drink rye. I think I should like rye. Or
well, Don Draper puts it in his old fashioned, so or in his Manhattan, or whatever he drinks. So I mean,
which was the original spirit in those cocktails, just like you mentioned before. And so, as we put this together, exactly what you said: well-rounded, a lot of flavor, a nice finish, warms but doesn't burn,
mm-hmm.
and be very flavorful.
Yeah.
And so, you do get some of those, what I call slightly bourbon notes of, vanilla and caramel,
mm-hmm.
but you're going to get right into that rye toast.
Yes.
And you're going to get into that, cinnamon. But then there's this kind of campfirey smoke too. And so it's just all very good with that. Mm-hmm.
So the name it's Rossville really Union, where did this name originate?
Okay. So Lawrenceburg, Indiana, the southeast corner of Indiana in the tri-state of Indiana, Kentucky, and Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
Sits right on the Ohio River.
Mm-hmm.
And distilling started there in like 1804.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of distilleries that kind of popped up in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. Of course, it was right on the Ohio, so that was a great trade route. It was in grain country. A lot of grain was grown there. But why Lawrenceburg particularly is it sits on a vast aquifer. So what's an aquifer? So when the glaciers came through millions of years ago, dug out these big caverns that now continually fill up with water.
Mm-hmm.
And that water passes through sand and gravel and limestone. And so that removes sulfur and iron that are impurities to whiskey.
Sure.
But the most important thing is when you pump that water out of the well, it was a constant 56 degrees.
Yeah.
So if you think about in the 1800s, there's no refrigeration, no electricity. And when you make alcohol, you produce a lot of heat.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got fermentation. And if you don't control fermentation, the heat of fermentation, the whiskey won't be very good. You know, you might even make vinegar. And so you don't want that. And then even when you distill, you've got to condense that alcohol vapor. And so you need cooling. And so if you're in the 1800s and you've got this constant 56-degree water, that's a godsend.
Yeah.
And so a lot of distilleries sprung up there. In 1847, George Ross started the Rossville Distillery in Lawrenceburg. And that distillery was the Rossville Distillery. And then he started buying up some of the smaller distilleries around him. And as he did that, he wanted everybody to feel part of the family. And he changed it from the Rossville Distillery to the Rossville Union. And so everybody was still part, you know, they operated some of the small stills that he bought up, but it was becoming a larger and larger distillery.
Sure.
It was the Rossville Distillery all the way through Prohibition. They actually made medicinal alcohol, a lot of gray neutral spirits. That was a United States pharmacopoeia that they could sell during Prohibition. And then after Prohibition, the Ross family sold it to Seagram's. And then it became the Seagram's Distillery all the way into the 90s until there was really no more Seagram's.
Sure.
And it passed through a couple other hands, and then MGP purchased the distillery. So as a nod to that kind of original distillery, we always knew that when we came out with a rye whiskey, it's going to be named Rossville. Mm-hmm.
That's a really great story. And it still says from when Seagram's owned the building. So if anybody has ever seen or ever been to the MGP compound, really, it's a very kind of nondescript, red brick building, but it still says Seagram's.
Yeah, and it gets confusing because it says Seagram's 1857 because that's the founding year of Seagram's. But Rossville, and why it's embossed on that bottle that you have right over at the top, established 1847.
Oh, yeah, right here. Oh, yeah. I got you. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's an interesting story. And Joe Cars, who is Joe, forgive me if I get this wrong, but like the sales rep or the sales or the brand ambassador. What is Joe's title? Joe Cars' title?
He's the sales director.
Sales director here in Illinois. So hi, Joe. He was actually the one that got us set up. And he said, it's very different from many of the big rye whiskeys out there. And I fully agree. I've got a couple of ryes behind me. One in particular that you can see here is a Pinhook rye, which is very, to me, it has that bite. It's just got that peppery bite, which, some people like, some people don't. I'm indifferent, but this one, you guys, if you haven't had all those out there in the Fox Valley Whiskey side, if you haven't had a chance to go pick up this Rossville Union, I want to say it retails, I think like $36 or something like that. 100% worth it. It's absolutely phenomenal.
One thing I want to
go ahead.
Point out about this real quick. Yeah. I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of times when people launch their brand, they'll put small batch. It's like, well, what does that mean? And it's like, well, it doesn't mean anything. Yeah. There's no definition of that other than the smallest batch you make is small batch.
Right.
And then, people will put batch 1, batch 2, batch 3. That doesn't mean anything too much either. But what you'll see on that bottle is how many barrels were used when we did that bottling.
Yes, right here.
Yes.
159 barrels.
Yes.
Which is significantly smaller than, say, I won't name any names. Let's say one of the larger distilleries that is called small batch, or any of the larger distilleries that are called small batch, could use 400, 500, 600, 700 barrels because to them that, that's small.
Yeah.
So 159 barrels. That
159
really
in that bottling. We did a few bottlings at that same barrel number. We're probably going to change that up so that as we do other bottlings, you'll know that, that barrel number changed a little bit. So it's a way of calling it or being the batch. But I like to think we got to go out and pick the very best 159 barrels for that bottling. And if you pick up a bottle of our barrel proof, probably the one you're going to see had 83 barrels picked for that.
Oh, wow. So even smaller.
Yeah.
And that was the one that I was almost going to get. And I'm like, no, I'm going to get this one instead. I should have got that one.
Yeah, you get them both.
Next time. Yeah, I'll get them. Yeah. Maybe I got to run back to the liquor store at some point this weekend. Anyway, right?
And that one's
right,
at
my wife is sitting right
barrels.
here.
That's 112.6 proof.
Yeah, and that's what actually drew me to that one. I like the higher proof. I like the heat. I like that. I like that oomph. And I saw it and I was like, no, I'll go with the basic Rossville. And I love it. This is one to keep on the shelf.
I will say it's a little dangerous because you're going to sip it kind of like it's a lower proof, and you'll before you know it, you've had a lot.
It's going to sneak up on you.
Yeah.
I want to remind everybody, if you guys have any questions out there, anybody who's watching live, please feel free to comment, whether it's on YouTube or on our Facebook. If you have any questions for David, they will pop up on the screen here. So if anybody has any questions about Remus or Rossville or any of the other MGP products or any questions for David, please feel free to ask. I want to talk about George Remus because this is I've got about a dozen books next to me, which is that one right there.
Yeah.
One of the two or three. Is there two Remus releases or is there three? Did I see that one? What is that? The one that opens up in the box?
All right. So there are actually three.
Okay.
So this George Remus straight bourbon whiskey at 94 proof. Now, that Rossville you have is also at 94. And so they're both at 94 for a reason. So 94 is a great sipping proof, but it's also a really good cocktail proof. If you're gonna make cocktails, you shouldn't make it with something that has such a low proof that kind of when you're done, you've made punch.
Right.
And so 94 proof was very, very good for those. And then we have our annual release that's called Remus Repeal Reserve.
Yep.
And so this comes out every year, and each year it's slightly different.
Oh, okay.
And we put right here on the label what's different about it.
Oh, that's interesting.
I don't know if I get this close enough, it'll be too distorted. But you will see that each year we put how much of the year and the type of mash bill that's in it.
Sure. Okay.
And so each year that changes. And so this is Series 3. This came out at the end of 2019. We are kind of already has Series 4 for 2020 wrapped up and ready to go in the bottles and be in distribution for this fall. You kind of have to be doing those now.
Okay, sure.
So, but then you'll see that this changes, and that's by design. Each year this changes. Now, all the bourbon in this one, 5 to 7 years old. All the bourbon in this one, over 10.
Oh, wow. Okay. Damn, I should have picked up that bottle.
I
should have
know.
got it while we were there. Next
and
time.
Then, because this is the 100th year anniversary of the Volstead Act, or what gave us prohibition.
It is, yeah, as of January.
Then the one you were talking about with the box that opens up is this one.
Yes, that one.
So this is our Remus Volstead Reserve 14-year-old bottled and bond bourbon. Okay. Probably you won't be able to find this right now.
Yeah, I know.
I think they all disappeared as soon as they came out. So,
so George Remus has, like I said, I've got about a dozen books next to me. I love reading the history of bourbon. I love reading the history of the United States and Prohibition. George Remus was a pharmacist turned attorney turned bootlegger during Prohibition. So what he would do is his pharmacies, because at the time during Prohibition, whiskey was a medicinal item. So his pharmacies would deliver or ship whiskey to place, destination A, B, or C, and then he would schedule a hijacking of those trucks, and then steal his own whiskey and then sell it as a bootlegger and make a huge profit. George Remus was a very smart man. He was a very cunning man. He is famously thought to have been the inspiration behind the character Jay Gatsby from The Great Gatsby.
Right.
He also killed his wife in real life, or his, I guess, technically ex-wife. He was put in jail, I want to say, for maybe like 2.5 years, and he was let go because he was diagnosed as clinically insane. And I think he ended up moving to Florida or something like that, just to kind of live out the rest of his days. But a very, very fascinating individual. One of the richest men in history. He made hundreds of millions of dollars off of bootlegging. What about the Remus line? Is there anything different about the Remus line that you can't find? Like, if I were a distillery and I wanted to source some barrels, is there anything about the Remus line that is specifically different from anything else that might be bottled by another brand?
It's interesting you asked me that, as well as how we started the show by talking about people sourcing whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
And the George Remus brand, we actually acquired that. So it started off with some guys in Cincinnati. Cincinnati is about 20 miles from Lawrenceburg, Indiana.
Okay.
And George Remus was, as you mentioned, a pharmacist and attorney in Chicago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And as soon as Prohibition came about in 1920, and he started defending bootleggers, he did realize he could make money, both first medicinal and then bootlegging. So he moved to Cincinnati. And the reason he moved to Cincinnati is because he was within a few hundred miles of all the shuttered whiskey warehouses, including the warehouses that were on our Lawrenceburg, Indiana distillery campus.
Sure.
And just like you said, he pulled out, he got those permits to obtain legal whiskey, but then he stole from himself. And at one time, George Remus was controlling 35% of all the alcohol in this country.
Which was outrageous.
Right. And because he was kind of this known person in Cincinnati, this group of guys started the George Remus brand in Cincinnati, and they sourced the bourbon from MGP, and it was a very young product. So the bourbon was only a couple of years old, and it was a single mash bill. And so when we acquired the brand, we wanted to make it more complex, give it more age. So all the bourbon in this is also 5 to 7 years old. And it's also, just like I talked about with Rossville, a combination of high rye bourbon mash bills. So we talked about high rye just a little bit in terms of rye whiskey, but not bourbon. Sure. So a lot of times when a bourbon touts itself as being high rye, it usually tops out at about 18%. So we make high rye bourbon at 21%, 36%. We've even made some at 49%.
Wow.
So, when you make it at 49%, it's really just 2% away from a rye whiskey.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's just corn and rye that point.
Yeah, exactly. So similar to the Rossville, by being a combination of bourbon, high rye bourbons, you get complexity more than just doing a single mash bill.
Sure.
And so this is a combination of high rye bourbons.
Sure.
And we don't talk about the percentages in each one because you are blending to a profile. And so depending on where the barrels might come from or the years of the barrels that you're putting together, the blending ratio might change, but you're after a profile.
Sure.
Whereas with this one, the reserve, we want you to know exactly what that blending profile and those percentages were, and that's why it changes every year.
Sure.
And as you mentioned, the legend is that George Remus was the inspiration for Gatsby, is why this doesn't look like your typical bourbon bottle.
I noticed. I like the Art Deco.
Very Art Deco.
I like the Art Deco design.
Yeah, exactly. So that's done on purpose. So
exactly. And you know, one of these years, I'm going to find that Repeal Reserve, and I'm going to see it because it's a pretty high retail.
the
Volstead? The Volstead Act, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it's totally worth it as a collector's item, you know, just how it's packaged. It seems like a lot of thought went into that, not just, you know, let's just make a bourbon, you know, and sell it at a high price for the sake of selling it at a premium, but let's really take the care and thought and really kind of make every little detail absolutely perfect.
Yeah, you keep going like this, and I'm sure nobody knows what you're talking about.
Nobody knows what I'm talking about. If you have the box, people will know what I'm talking about when I do that.
All right.
There we go.
Okay. So this is what he's talking about. I got to get this right. This is the box. And then the box would open.
It opens like this.
Yes. And then there's the Repeal.
And it's just a beautifully displayed bourbon. It's a great story. If anybody is interested in reading about George Remus, there's God only knows how many books written about the man. Fred Minnick has written about him. Michael Veach has written about him. A lot of different people have written about him. Fascinating human being. You know, just a very, very interesting topic. You mentioned about labels, and you and I had mentioned very, very briefly before we got on. So one of the hot topics in 2015 was the Templeton Rye scandal. Now I'm sure there are some legalities involved that you may not be able to talk about, but tell us what people should be looking for when you look at a label on a bottle of whether it's bourbon or rye that will let them know who made it and where the product comes from, because this can get kind of confusing when it comes to labels. For instance, on the back, it says, on the back of the Rossville, it says distilled by Rossville Distillery, Lawrenceburg, Indiana. So that can get kind of confusing. What should people be looking for when they look at a label and say, okay, who was this distilled by and where did it come from?
Okay. There's a couple of things. When you look at any bottle, it's going to say distilled by, or distilled and bottled by, or just bottled by.
Sure.
So if you see bottled by, maybe those people didn't distill it.
Sure.
Don't know. Now, I will tell you that if you see the name of a state on the front of the label as part of the name, then you know it was made in that state.
Right.
So if it says Kentucky bourbon, MGP didn't make it. Okay?
Right.
Maybe if it doesn't, we probably did. I don't know.
Right.
But and if you do see distilled in Indiana, there's a pretty good chance.
And that's what I did. We do a lot of events we did a lot of events through the Fox Valley Whiskey Society, different tastings and dinner events. And I would always tell people when they ask, you know, if a lot of people would ask about MGP, and, you know, how do I know if it's MGP juice or not? And one thing I would say is if it says distilled in Indiana, chances are it's an MGP product, which is not a bad thing. MGP has quite a following. Quite a fanboy following. There's a group, the Adventures in Bourbon Club. TJ and Will, if you guys happen to be watching, or anybody from the Adventures in Bourbon Club, hello. Thank you for tuning in. They are MGP fanboys. They seek out those craft distilleries from across the Midwest and the United States, and they try to pick out that MGP juice. And you guys, like I said, you guys do a really great job. But like you said, you know, it's good to know, you know, where it comes from. And is there anything else that we should be looking for as to, you know, distilled, bottled by, made in, or anything like that to kind of give us some hints as to where it might be coming from?
Well, most likely you're going to have to turn that bottle around and look on the back.
Yeah.
To see how that's talked about. And really, it was from that particular incident that you brought up, really caused people to step back and say, you know, I need to be transparent.
Yeah.
And if I'm transparent, then no one can say I was duped or misled or or somehow you bluffed me. Let's just be honest about it.
Sure.
And I think what you're seeing now is more of the blending from multiple states, where you do see there's some Indiana, there's some Kentucky, there's some Tennessee. Those are the three main ones that you'll see put together. And so, and then people are just doing their own thing with all of that.
Sure.
Just like you can take MGP whiskey or MGP bourbon and maybe finish it in some other kind of barrel, or store it for a while in a different area. That all happens, and that's what helps make what might seem to some people the same liquid be unique for that brand. Sure.
So you guys obviously, as a this very large distillery, you primarily sell your output to various bottlers, but you guys do have your own brands of bourbon and rye, which we talked about, as well as vodka. Tell us about what else we can find in the MGP portfolio that might only be made available in certain areas, like the Tanner's Creek, the 8 and Sand. And I also want to ask about the vodka, because the vodka in the vodka world is actually pretty unique in its we'll call mash bill. Tell us about the Tanner's Creek, the 8 and Sand, and the vodka that you have for those who might not know about it.
I'll be happy to. So 8 and Sand is a blended bourbon whiskey, and you can get this in all of our markets. The Tanner's Creek that you talked about is really only in Indiana.
Okay. And
on the back of it, it says "Made by Hoosiers for Hoosiers." So that's kind of the nod to the
only in Indiana.
Yeah. But we wanted everybody else to experience a blended bourbon whiskey. Now, what exactly does that mean when you say blended bourbon whiskey? So if you have, first of all, I think most people are just familiar with blended whiskeys.
Sure.
And if nothing is majority, so you've got some bourbon, you've got some rye whiskey, you've got some corn whiskey, you have light whiskey, and you put all those together, you call that a blended whiskey.
Sure.
And then most blended whiskeys are predominantly grain neutral spirits, otherwise known as vodka.
Right.
So, and you will see on the back of those bottles somewhere they have to disclose the percentage of grain neutral spirits. So our 8 and Sand blended bourbon whiskey doesn't have any grain neutral spirits in it. It's all whiskey. Now, at MGP, we make bourbon, we make rye whiskey, we make corn whiskey, we make light whiskey. All of those are put together to make this product. But because it's majority bourbon is why it's a blended bourbon whiskey.
Gotcha. Okay. And that's available in all your markets, which now you're in, you said 16 states.
Yes.
Illinois being, and now that I see the label, it looks pretty familiar. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. I've seen it. And then a lot of people go 8 and Sand. What's that all about? So that's an old railroad term. So 8 was the highest throttle position on the locomotive, and you would put sand between the wheels and the rails to gain traction. And somewhere along the line, the term 8 and Sand became synonymous with smooth sailing or good luck.
Oh, okay.
And so we kind of revised that term and wanted you to have smooth sailing or, a good time out there on the rails. And by doing that, we also, in this nod to really what helped really not industrialized, I don't really want to say that, but really kind of helped bridge the country was the railroads. And who doesn't like trains? Is that when we put this together in this nod to the railroads, we said in the markets that we are in, we're going to donate some of the proceeds to kind of rail preservation or rail history.
Oh, okay.
And so in our certain markets, we've done that.
Yeah.
And at our Atchison, Kansas distillery, just north of Kansas City, just 2 blocks from the distillery, sets this actual locomotive, the 811, which was part of the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
So you guys really have a, MGP is kind of seen as this, this industrialized kind of, distillery that just, pumps out all of this, this product. But you guys really have you try to tie in a lot of, heritage and history into your product, which I wasn't really familiar with. Learning the story of the Rossville and the 8 and Sand, the Remus, which I already knew about. It just kind of it brings you from this big, ginormous, monstrous distillery into this, this small, hometown kind of, not craft distillery, but you do help the craft distilleries. It kind of, I think it puts it puts a little bit better of a spin on it for people who are out there who might say like, oh, MGP, they're, they just sell to other people, yada yada yada. But you guys are very tied in with, with American history and bourbon history, and that's really cool that you guys, try to name everything after.
Well, it's like this guy.
Yeah.
So he was not only close to Lawrenceburg because he was in Cincinnati.
Sure.
But he pulled barrels from warehouses that used to sit on our distillery campus. He actually put his brother-in-law in charge of some of those. And it was actually barrels, ended up being bottles from that warehouse that got him busted. So really? there's a big tie to George Remus and Lawrenceburg. And so that's what made it seem genuine to us that, we could have picked anybody out of Prohibition history and named a brand after.
Right.
But there is a legitimate tie, not only because he was close in Cincinnati, but to the actual distillery campus.
Yeah.
So,
and that's just such a cool, I mean, there's such cool stories, behind all this stuff.
So now we'll talk about vodka. So,
I want to talk
all
about
you whiskey guys who now want to go to the bathroom. You don't have to.
Yeah, let's talk about the vodka real quick. And if God forbid, if Fred Minnick should be watching this, his hashtag and his logo on everything is vodka sucks. But he's a whiskey guy. So Fred, if you ever happen to watch this, tune away now.
And here's the way I look at it: is we're on here because we like whiskey,
sure,
and we like bourbon. But there's people in our lives that don't.
Yeah, that's true.
But they still want to enjoy a good spirit. And when I talk about our Till American Wheat vodka, that is one of them. So while MGP makes a lot of vodka for other people, it's all corn-based.
Sure.
And so when we came out with our own brand, it's like, how do we want to be a little different? And so this is made at our Atchison, Kansas distillery. And, Kansas is known for a few things: being flat, tornadoes, the Wizard of Oz, and wheat.
Yeah.
So we can do something with one of those, and we're going to make a vodka. And so MGP also has a food ingredients division. We make wheat starches and proteins that go into a lot of bread, pasta, pastries. We export wheat protein pretty much all over the world. And so we've been used to, since MGP started in 1941, knowing a lot about wheat and kind of being from the wheat state. We said, this is what our vodka is going to be. And so this vodka, as a wheated vodka, would kind of line up against a lot of the imported vodkas that aren't potato or rye, but there's some pretty famous brands that are made from wheat. And I do a lot of side-by-sides with some of those, and you will experience no burn, no aftertaste. A lot of people are hesitant to try vodka by itself because they never have. It's always with juice, or it's with this, or what's that. Sure. And this kind of like that Rossville can be a little dangerous because it is smooth. It's got this kind of creamy vanilla-ness to it with just a little mint that is very enjoyable. Just with a little lime, certainly with club soda or tonic.
Yeah.
And then about the name. So where our Atchison, Kansas distillery sits, before there was a distillery there was a plow company. And Atchison sits right on the Missouri River. And so as people would come across into Kansas and go settle the prairie, they pick up a plow. And so as a nod to that heritage, that's why we called our vodka Till, American Wheat Vodka. Yeah. That's why there's the farm scene on the bottle. Get out of the glare with the wheat rows, and then of course the farmer with the
horse and till. Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. Yeah, when I read about that, and we were on with Nick with Whiskey Acres on Wednesday night, and they have a vodka. And I asked him, I said, I'm not really much of a vodka drinker. I do like a vodka tonic from time to time. Whiskey Acres vodka, one of the predominant flavor profiles is butterscotch of all things. And I said, where is that coming from? And he said, it's the corn. It comes directly from the corn. What kind of vodka per designation by United States government is a characterless, odorless, tasteless spirit? What?
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
They just changed that. Yeah.
So and that is it's starting to change. You're starting to see a lot of these craft distilleries not make flavored vodkas, but just make vodka in a different way that's really lending some really creative and interesting flavor profiles. So when we try the Till vodka, with Whiskey Acres, it's butterscotch. I mean, it's like a butterscotch hard candy almost. It's almost eerie. What can we expect out of the Till vodka as far as like a flavor profile if we should drink it neat?
Yeah, you are going to get a little vanilla and mint. More mint on the finish.
Okay.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty interesting. See, I'm not a vodka guy, but I might have to add that to the
and then there's this creaminess to the mouthfeel. So, could you equate that to wheat? I mean, think of cream of wheat. So in a way that kind of goes together, just kind of like the butterscotch did with the corn.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. It's a really we look at spirit sales across the board, and we kind of talk to the guys over at Binny's and all these different liquor stores and say what's kind of the emerging thing. And vodka really isn't. Vodka was for a long time. Vodka was really kind of what put bourbon out of fashion. Back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, thanks to a dapper, pardon my French, but a dapper son of a bitch named James Bond. So vodka hasn't again kind of taken off. We're starting to see like rum and tequila take off. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised with a lot of these craft distilleries starting to come out with vodkas, because vodka is easy to make. It's cheap to make, and you can push it out right away, and you can get it out right away.
Make it today, bottle it tomorrow.
So we're starting to see a lot of these craft distilleries put out vodka and gin. Or they always have. I think we'll start to see over maybe over the next decade or so, we'll start to see vodka start to make a comeback with not necessarily flavored vodkas, but just different flavor profiles of the grain that's used and the distilling method. So it's really interesting. So maybe my wife. So for those of you guys who know, our studio is basically in our bedroom, and my wife is actually right behind me, and she's looking. She's like, we need to get that vodka. I want to talk about your the mash bills there at MGP. You guys have 5. And correct me if I'm wrong. 5 different bourbons and 3 different rye mash bills to choose from on your website, which I went to a couple weeks ago, and just like I was like, oh yeah, I'm sure I'm a distiller, yada yada, and I just kind of selected. And somebody actually got in touch with me like within an hour, which was crazy. Yeah. Somebody got in touch with me and was like, would you like a sample? Would you like this? And I'm like, I run a whiskey society, and I do it with live cast. I'm not an actual distiller. I was just curious to see how easy it was. Very, very easy. Very easy to actually select a mash bill. But what I'm curious about is, do you guys will create a mash bill as well if somebody comes to you and says, I want to use this mash bill for a product?
Yeah.
What are some of the weirder strange or kind of off the wall mash bills that somebody has come to you and said, would this work?
It's not been so much that the grain has been odd. I mean, there's a lot of varieties of corn. So, you've got red corn, blue corn, yellow corn, white corn, Indian corn, and some of those don't have a very good starch content.
Sure.
So when you think about any grain, it has starch and protein. We don't do anything with the protein but get rid of it and make distiller's dried grain out of it for animal feed, cattle feed. So you need the starch. And if something has a low amount of starch, then it's not going to yield a lot of alcohol. And so those tend to be very expensive mash bills with kind of these boutique grains that don't have a lot of starch. But to me, the grain isn't the odd thing. It's when people come and they want to use some crazy yeast.
Yeah.
And at MGP, we have a proprietary strain of yeast that we've used for decades. We actually bank it at various locations outside of the distillery, so that if something were ever to happen, we'd never lose that strain. And the vast majority of all the whiskey we make, bourbon we make, is from that yeast strain. Every once in a while, people will want to come along, and they've said, we've somehow gotten this wild yeast from the hills of God knows where, and it's like, and I'm sure that will make a very good marketing story, but I have no idea if it's going to make a good whiskey. And so generally, I tell them, we can use that yeast, but however this turns out, it's yours.
Right.
And if you don't like it, it's still yours.
It's still yours. Yeah. At the end of the day.
And generally, that gives them enough pause to say, why don't you just use the yeast you're familiar with? And we know that we'll make a good whiskey, and we don't do that. But, we've done a few, and I'd say it's about 50-50 on whether they were good or not. So
that kind of leads into my next question. And this one, maybe I don't know if I guess give me the best answer that you can. When it comes to craft distilleries, one of the hardest things to achieve is when a consumer purchases your whiskey, not just once, but 2, 3, even 4 times. Do you think it's harder for a craft distillery to get the consumer to purchase your product once, or is it harder to get them to purchase your product twice, 3 times, 4 times, etc.?
I'm sure any salesperson would say the hardest thing is a repeat sale, no matter if you're craft or not.
Sure.
I'm hoping after this, people go out and find Rossville or Till vodka or George Remus bourbon, and that they like it enough that they would buy it again.
Sure.
And I also think, did they buy it at the distillery? Did they buy it at the tasting room because they were on vacation? They passed through here. This seemed like the thing to do.
Sure.
But now that I'm away from there, I can't find it. So that's just like right now, we are in 16 states, and there's some states where somebody might be listening to this and they can't get any of these yet. Yeah. So that's all part of it is the distribution and how available is it. And we're seeing a little of that open up because of the current situation we're in about how people shipping, and let's be a little more creative with alcohol as opposed to just closing all the stores and nobody can drink. And so it's an interesting time in that, and I think that's all evolving, and states are thinking more a little differently about what they can do. I'm certainly not an expert on any of those, but it just seems like that everyone's kind of opened their eyes and said, we don't have to do it how we enacted everything in 1933.
Right.
And that's really, a lot of our states have some pretty archaic laws, and they go all the way back to that. So
yeah. So I want to, obviously right now with what's going on, with this COVID-19 crisis, this is kind of why I started doing this, because we can't really have that face to face. MGP is playing a large role in hand sanitizer production. In fact, has always supplied alcohol for hand sanitizer production, even before the COVID-19 pandemic. It must feel good knowing that you're helping fight a battle that could very well stretch into 2022 and beyond. Talk to us about your response to finding out about the pandemic and how MGP would assist in the fight against COVID-19.
Okay. So primarily at our Atchison, Kansas distillery, but at a small degree also at the Lawrenceburg distillery, we do make a lot of grain neutral spirits or ethyl alcohol that is used in both hand sanitizer and various disinfectants. So most of that goes out as United States Pharmacopoeia or USP alcohol. We do denature alcohol, and the whole reason you do denature it is so that the tax liability goes down because it's not potable anymore. You can't drink. And that's used in a lot of those various formulations. And so we've supplied those industries for decades. And as this came about, the demand has skyrocketed. And so we can't make enough of that actually right now. And so, and then also at our Lawrenceburg, Indiana distillery, our Atchison, Kansas distillery, and our new distillery that we just purchased this year in Washington, D.C., which is the Green Hat Gin Distillery. We have been filling 5-gallon containers of hand sanitizer for first responders. And so while a lot of people have been making it to sell because they've needed the revenue, we've taken a small amount, a very small amount of our alcohol and made the approved hand sanitizer that the FDA has approved and just donated it, just given it to fire departments, highway patrol, some hospitals, a few nursing homes, but mostly those first responders kind of just close to our distilleries and part of our communities.
Sure. So Andrew Meyer, who asked, I hope that answers your question. That question popped up kind of right as I asked that. Andrew asked, in different groups I belong to, I've seen distilleries made hand sanitizer and how COVID times has affected them. Has MGP dealt with this new times and what's the future? So I hope that kind of answered that for you, Andrew. Andrew actually shows that we do a virtual pub every once in a while. Andrew's a friend of mine. He's a air traffic controller over here in Aurora, Illinois. So hi, Andrew. Hopefully,
Andrew.
We'll see you soon for the next virtual pub. We talked about kind of like the art and the science of blending. One of the things that I kind of want to know is, MGP is sources to a lot of different distilleries around the United States. And from what I've heard is that, a lot of the older stuff is being taken. So it's a lot of younger stuff that's being sold now. What's the oldest whiskey that you have aging at MGP?
I can't say.
Oh, you can't say, or you don't know?
Oh, I know.
Okay. So it's old. It's old, you guys. It's from the Seagram's days, and it's going to be coming.
Not that. There probably wouldn't be much left if it was.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, there would probably be a couple drops in the bottom of the barrel.
So as a brand, we talked about how both the George Remus and the Rossville, both at 94 proof, were about 5 to 7 years old. Then I talked about the Repeal, which comes out every year. And what's been in this has been anywhere from 10 to 12 years old. And then we just did the Volstead, which was 14-year-old bottled and bond. And those are all very good years. And you run the risk of, to me, with bourbon and rye whiskey, that you can get a little too old. And, things get a little oaky, it gets a little tar. That's why I always think people that have primarily been Scotch drinkers don't understand American bourbon or whiskey because they're aged completely different. We're talking about a new charred oak barrel for both of those, whereas Scotch and Irish whiskey are in a used bourbon barrel for the most part. And so it takes longer to draw those flavor compounds out of a barrel, as well as both of those places, Scotland and Ireland, are kind of a horrible place to age because the climate doesn't lend itself to a big temperature swing like you get in the Midwest, where most bourbon and whiskey is made.
Sure.
And so you can't compare the two ages, because I get those snobby remarks sometimes. It's like, well, that's awful young for a whiskey. It's like, compared to what? Compared to Scotch? Well, yeah, it is, but there's a reason for that. So
that's a good answer. And I actually I get that question sometimes too. And we do events at a local restaurant here. It's called McNally's Irish Pub. Everything is kind of closed down right now. But McNally's Irish Pub obviously is known for their Irish whiskey, which is kind of like a good kind of in between. For people who don't know if they like bourbon, they don't know if they like Scotch. I like to tell them, like, try a good Irish whiskey. It might be that good, that good in between. And one of the questions that I get is, why do you see Scotch that's aged to 20, 30, 40, 50 plus years, and you only see bourbon that might be aged to, I think at the most I saw a oh God, I can't even remember what it was. It was some brand that was aged to some god awful 32 years or something like that. And the answer is simple: is Kentucky goes through hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold. So you can get a 4-year bourbon that tastes phenomenal. You can get a 3-year or 2-year bourbon that tastes phenomenal. Scotland and Ireland are pretty much miserable all the time. It's gloomy, it's muggy. It might get warm there, it might get hot, but it's pretty gloomy and muggy and chilly most of the time. So a whiskey can sit in a barrel for 50, 60 years and still be drinkable. Do you imagine drinking, if any bourbon was even left in a barrel after 50 or 60 years?
That would be awful. That'd be the most thing is, would there be anything left?
Would there be anything left, right? And if there was, how terrible it would taste. It would just taste like wood at that point.
It would be pretty oaky. Yeah.
It would be pretty. So I've got so we're up on the hour. I have one more question for you, and this is just kind of kind of off the top of your head. You've obviously had the chance to help create many great whiskeys, and I'm sure have sampled even more. What are some of the whiskeys that stick out as some of your favorites, and what is in your whiskey glass on the average night? What is David Whitmer sipping on?
Rossville Union Barrel Proof.
Okay, so in other words, I'm going to have to go later on this afternoon and get the. You
are going to have to go get it. Yes. Now that's on any given night. I've showed you a lot of full bottles of stuff, but there's a lot of empty bottles around here too.
Oh, I bet.
And so every Remus Repeal series is just a new treat. And so it's fun to never deplete the bottle or have another bottle of like series 1, 2, or 3, because then when 4 is born, it's like I go back and compare it to all its brothers and sisters. And so that's kind of why people do collect them and they get them, and then they can compare and contrast. And because we put right on the label the amount of the different mash bills, you can actually then taste that difference.
Yeah.
I can read about it and I can taste it. And okay, there's slightly different years here, but how did a higher 21% rye impact versus more 36% rye?
Sure.
Or just like that. So to me, that's just a lot of fun. But
yeah,
that's kind of my job too, and that's why I'm a geek at this stuff. But I think we're talking to a lot of geeks about this stuff too. And so you can't do that with a lot of brands. You can't just say, what makes this different? This is the way it always is. No, people are always trying to extend their line, and whether they'll finish it in a different kind of barrel and all that. But this is taking primarily the same bourbons, older bourbons, and how you can change those up and see what they're like.
Sure.
Hopefully one of these days we'll all be, when we all get back together, we do what we call Masters of Rye. And I would actually bring in samples of a 51% rye and a 95% rye. And we would try them individually and, taste the difference in that rye. And then I'd give you some more, and you get to be your own master blender for a while and mix them at whatever ratio you want.
Yeah.
And then we would try the Rossville that you just tried alongside of it. And so you kind of appreciate how you build in complexity by putting those various mash bills together.
Sure.
And you could do that with a bourbon class too. So that's just a lot of fun for me. And so I've always enjoyed it, and I like doing it with other people. Sure. And to help them really understand that art of blending that's more than just a single mash bill, and I'm trying to achieve consistency.
Right. Mm-hmm. So Andrew has one final question.
Andrew. Okay.
Andrew, so on the screen here, can you tell us about your barrels? How many do you have aging? What char level do you prefer? And where are your barrels made?
Okay. So for so by law, bourbon, rye whiskey, wheat whiskey, malt whiskey in the United States need to be in a new charred oak barrel. Mm-hmm. Okay. Some people will tell you it has to be in a new charred American oak barrel. By law, it doesn't have to be American oak. It's just that most of them are.
Right.
And so American oak is grown in southern Missouri, that Ozark area of Arkansas, Kentucky, southern Ohio, Tennessee to most part. And so that's where most of the trees are. That's where the Coopers are. We get our barrels from 3 of the main Coopers in the United States. And for the most part, and I can say this for all of our brands, it's a number 4 char on the staves and a number 2 char on the head. And so the staves are the long part of the barrel. The heads are the top and the bottom, or the sides, however the barrel's oriented. And if it's a number 4 char, that means that wood has been on fire for 55 seconds to maybe a minute 10. And the number 4 char is often called an alligator char because that burnt wood will blister and look just like alligator skin. Whereas a number 2 char is very light, and it's still on fire and it's still burnt, but not to that depth. And the reason you do 2 different levels often is because of that different penetration into the wood will allow different flavor compounds to come out of the wood as the whiskey matures. The way to contrast that is a wine barrel is toasted. And so it isn't on fire, it's just heated up. Mm-hmm. And the best way to always keep a wine barrel and a whiskey barrel separate is think about you're roasting a marshmallow. And you've got your marshmallow on the stick and you're painstakingly turning it so slowly so that it's the perfect golden brown. That's a wine barrel. And then somebody says your name and all of a sudden you look away and the marshmallow's on fire. That's a whiskey barrel. And so sometimes you'll hear about a whiskey barrel being toasted and then charred. Mm-hmm. So they'll heat it up slowly and it will get a toast to it. But by law, you still have to char it. Mm-hmm. And then generally it's a lower char. So you don't, because that allowed kind of this deeper heat penetration into the wood. And then you've charred it for legal reasons. And by doing that, you can get kind of a different profile out of the whiskey. Or if you were going to do maybe a wheat whiskey or a malt whiskey, which MGP does do for some people, you kind of want those subtler tones out of the barrel as opposed to a number 4 char that you would do with a high rye bourbon or rye whiskey.
Sure. So,
and that's also fun to play with too, as far as different chars and what kind of flavor compounds you get or flavor profiles you get out of a whiskey. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure there's so many different variables, that when it comes to bourbon and rye or whatever, there's so many different variables. One of the questions that I actually just got more recently, and I actually had to Google it because I wasn't sure. I got certified as a bourbon steward, which was might mean something to somebody, but I didn't really know much about the barrels. And what I found out was that when you char the barrel, you're taking that lignin, which is the protein that basically holds the wood structure together. And when you heat it up and it breaks down and it turns into vanillin, which is what gives bourbon its classic vanilla flavor. So that was really interesting. And I realized that there's way more into the bourbon science, specifically when it comes to barrels, that I just had no idea about. So now there's more books that I have to read, more articles that I have to read. And
there's a tremendous amount of wood chemistry that people don't. I mean, unfortunately, there's people that have no idea that bourbon gets all its color from the barrel. You know, it's as white as vodka coming off the still, and you know, it does get a lot of that flavor. And Andrew had one other question. He wanted to know how many barrels we have, and all I can say is a lot.
A lot. Many. There are many barrels, Andrew.
That's right.
And Andrew, maybe one of these days we'll be able to go to MGP and sample some whiskey out of those barrels together. Wouldn't that be fun?
Well, next year your group should do one of our barrel picks. So this year this was the first year we did that in both the Rossville line and the Remus line. The George Remus bourbon barrel pick was at barrel proof.
Sure. And
then with our Rossville, because we already have a barrel proof, we were offering that at 100 proof.
Oh, okay. See, I didn't know MGP did. I didn't know you guys did. I mean, obviously there's the sourcing aspect of things, but I didn't know you guys did barrel picks for the Rossville. So maybe
this was the first year we did it.
Maybe coming up here we'll have to do we'll have to try a barrel pick with the Rossville, and hopefully we can get. I think we're just shy of 1,300 members in our club, so I think we can. Right. I think we can get some people together. Okay. David, anything else?
Joe about that?
Yeah, we'll get with Joe. David, anything else you want to add, whether it be about MGP or the blending process or anything that you want to add before we sign off and I start sipping some more of this bourbon on a Friday night?
I will not hold you up to do that. So, Michael, I just want to thank you for having us on to let me talk about MGP and our brands. I appreciate the support that people have for MGP product, no matter what bottle it's in. But as a brands company, as a distiller, we've been doing this a while. Mm-hmm. But as brands, we're fairly new. We're kind of a startup in that regard. And so I would just ask people to try them. Go seek them out. George Remus, Rossville, 8 and Sand, Till vodka, all the above, and give it a try.
Yeah, and I think everybody will be very pleasantly surprised with what they find. David, thank you so much for coming on. Andrew and everybody who watched. I know my buddy Mark Augustin normally watches while he does the dishes. So Mark, I hope you cleaned all the dishes very well. I know a lot of other people like to tune in later. Joe, thank you for setting this up. David, thank you for coming on with us. Absolutely. And thank you for everybody at MGP who has been supplying hand sanitizer for the COVID-19 fight to keep us all healthy and to keep these digits clean. Thank you for coming on tonight. I will hopefully next this year or next year when all this is over, we can come in there and put on some hard hats and do a little tour of the distillery, and we'll definitely have to keep in touch.
That'd be great.
All right, David. Everybody out there, thank you for watching. Next week, we are going to be on with Mike and Matt Blom. Next Whiskey Wednesday, we're going to be talking Blom Brothers, which is very famously known for using some MGP products in their very storied history. So make sure to tune in next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Central. David, I'm going to log off, but feel free to hang out for a little while. Everybody out there, cheers. It is Friday. So make sure to pick up a rye and make sure it's either Rossville or the Rossville cask strength. And we will see all you guys next